Good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming to the 16th edition of the Archives Public Lecture Series. I have to say this every time. For those of you who don't know, we have an archive on campus, especially if you're coming from outside. It's open to the public, so please come by, and we'd love to see what you're interested in the archives, and maybe you can give us some ideas as to what we should stock it with. Couple of just housekeeping announcements. There is a sign-up sheet going around the room. Only sign up on it if you're not on the list and you'd like to be on the list. If you don't want spam, don't sign up. 4 to 5 emails a month is what we send out. But if you're already on the list, you get spammed. This is the 16th in the series. Our effort in the series has been, since the beginning, to try and get some diversity of conversation across disciplines. So there's a little bit of history, there's a little bit of science, very often politics, surprisingly, which is good. But the effort has always been just try and get people from different disciplines to speak to each other at least once a month. And there's always tea, except for one time, outside after the talk. I got a lot of grief about that once. So the tea will be served in the amphitheater just outside the archives. If you're interested in visiting the archives after this, just ask many of us who've been working there so we can help you sort of walk through that space. With that said, it is my deep pleasure to introduce Aisha Ramachandran to you. We've been talking about this conversation for the last few months now, and we're very lucky to have her here. She's on a sabbatical. She heads back to Yale in a little less than a month, I think.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. So very excited to have her here, and really thank her for sort of making the time for this. A quick introduction. Aisha Ramachandran is the Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and an affiliate of the Programs in Renaissance Studies and the History of Science and Medicine at Yale. A literary and cultural historian of early modern Europe, she pursues interdisciplinary research on literature, philosophy, cartography, visual culture, and the history of science, focusing on the long histories of globalization and modernity. The first prize-winning book, The World Makers, provides a cultural and intellectual history of the world, showing how it emerged as a cultural keyword in early modernity. And I wanted to thank her. There's a copy of the book in the archive, so any of you wants to come by and have a look at it, you're most welcome to do so. So our current projects range from new research on early, modern, and contemporary South Asia to work comparative philology, cartography, oral history, and lyric studies. A new book, Manuscript in Progress, tentatively titled Lyric Thinking, Humanism, Self-Code, and Modernity, concerns lyrics, entanglements with philosophy. With the help of a Mellon New Directions Fellowship, which was awarded in 2016, she's pursuing research on cross-cultural contacts between Europe and the Indo-Islamic world in the early modern period. And recently, her interest in worldmaking has extended into the 20th century. She's also working on a project to capture the experience of commissioned officers in the Indian Army between 1945 and 1975, and their service both within India and across the world. Please do give her a warm welcome for the talk titled Renaissance and Revolution.
Thank you so much, Venkat, for that gracious and very warm welcome. I want to start by saying I'm thrilled it's a full house for maps, and it almost always is, because who doesn't love these beautiful objects? And so before I get started, and I hope that you will join me, I have a lot of images. I thought that it would be useful and fun to give you a rapid overview of how we came to have the kind of iconic world map that we still tend to imagine when we think about the world today. But that does mean that I'm going to sacrifice going into detail in many of these maps. And so if there's one that you particularly love and want to ask me about, please just remember which one it is, and I'm happy to go back to it in the Q&A. Let me start, though, by saying, by giving a shout-out to all archivists, and to sort of say how lucky I think you are to have an archive here on campus. Much of the work that I've done here would not be possible without the incredible generosity of archivists in many, many different places, like Venkat. And so this being an archive at NCBS talk, in some ways, I'm happy to sort of remember the incredible work that people like archivists all over the world do to curate, preserve, and make available these materials that allow us to go back and think about why they continue to be important to us even today. Okay, so with that, I'm going to start with a question. Would anybody like to say anything about these two maps and how they are different or similar? Yes?
Yeah, the one below the Mercator Projection, it's not actually geographical area projection.
Mm-hmm.
It more accurately represents the sizes of the continents.
Okay, very good. Anything else? Anyone wants to observe? Yes?
One is political, one is more landscape.
Okay, what makes you say that?
Seems to be colored across countries,
Yeah.
and the lower one seems to be colored, like United States is colored.
Yes, okay, very good. I mean, so notice here that coloring actually makes a very big difference on maps and what they're trying to sort of talk about, and we'll get back to that. Also that, to go with that coloring, standardization, right? I mean, you see multiple colors and you kind of know the rough shape of countries, so you notice with political, this naturalistic coloring suggests, as you said, landscape. That itself is its own history of standardization. Other things that, yes?
The size of the countries in the map below shows Greenland to be the size of Africa, which we know it's not, whereas the one above, in terms of area, seems to be more accurate.
Yes, exactly right. We'll talk more about why that is in a moment. Yes.
I think Antarctica is missing from first map.
Yes, absolutely. And again, this comes back to the question of being a political map. Antarctica, not a political country, so not relevant to this map. However, you can see the bottom of it over there on the top map. Anything else?
Grid lines there.
Very good. Grid lines, absolutely. Notice the absence of the grid lines on this map. And again, we'll talk a lot about how the introduction of grid lines is itself a kind of very important scientific sort of revolutionary moment in the 15th century in a moment. Anything else?
Ocean currents?
Yes, who said ocean currents? Yes, thank you. Yes, absolutely. So you notice that the sea is not inert, right, in the top map, as it is in the bottom map where it's just background, really, and it's totally flat. There were two other hands in the back, yes? Yes, exactly. Somebody else pointed that out too. Yeah, not there because it's a political map. Antarctica, not a political entity in a meaningful way yet, perhaps. Anything else? Please come in. Have a seat in the front. I'm not scary, I promise. I'll wait. Anything else anyone observed that's striking about this? No? Good? Okay, so we've covered some of the main things here, and I'd like to start with this, partly to think about how the question of the shaping of maps and map representation still affects how we look at, think about, and encounter the world in front of us, before taking us back to the history of how we got here. So this first map is the world on the Gauss-Peters projection, sometimes known as just the Peters projection, was introduced in 1973 with an important claim for being a so-called post-colonial or decolonial map, because as the first person who spoke pointed out, it is an equal area map, which is to say that the relative sizes of the continents are relatively are in relation to each other. The second map you saw is in fact a map on the Mercator projection. And it is what's known as a conformal map, which I'll talk about in just a second, which is to say that it is essentially a navigational map, and I'll explain what that means. So it is not at all meant to represent the area of the continent as being relative in size to each other. Hence, Africa is the size of Greenland, as somebody else pointed out here. If you look here at the overlay here, and the outline gives you the shape of the Mercator continent, overlaid on top of the Gauss-Peters continent. You can see how radically different these two maps actually are. I want to start by saying that I don't want to make a claim, and in fact today's lecture is all about how perhaps we should not use the word accurate to talk about mapping at all. Because every time we look at a map, we are looking at a set of choices that a map maker has made in the act of deciding how to represent the world. I'm going to talk primarily about world maps in this lecture, but if there are questions later, we can talk more about other kinds of maps as well, partly because world maps pose unique kinds of challenges that deserve their own consideration. So this, as you can see here, these maps have very different goals, and they are working towards different ends. But the point here is they both ultimately have political stakes. I'll come to talking more about how maps and why maps have these incredible political stakes, but it's worth remembering that even today, any map we look like has a politics or a set of choices behind it. It could be a range of things, depending, for instance, many of you may have seen the wonderful maps of lighted areas of the world, right, places where electricity is concentrated. None of these maps are free of certain sets of choices, and those choices make them political in various ways. So the Mercator Projection, which is much maligned today, we are told frequently about the so-called Mercator lie, this is not what the world actually looks like, it perhaps remains the most important map projection in modern history. It remains the backbone of the web Mercator projection used in Google Maps. It is still used extensively, especially in aeronautical mapping. There are particular uses for it that continue to be used even today. The Mercator Projection is also the great landmark of 16th century cartography, and it marks the culmination of a revolution in mapmaking that allowed Europeans to navigate the world and allowed us to imagine the world as a global whole. What I want to look at here for a second, what I have given you here, is a 1944 American-British map on the Mercator Projection that was produced just before the end of the Second World War, and it's called A Pictorial History of Transport and Communications, but a Mercator map of the world united, right? It's again a map that is about transportation, but on the brink of the end of the Second World War, tries to imagine the world as a whole, and in doing so looks back to another moment at the very beginning of this kind of idea of global unity at the very end of the 16th century. So the use of Mercator Projection leads to lots of different kinds of historical, practical, as well as political uses, as you'll see in a moment. So what's special about the Mercator Projection? The way I like to explain this to my students is, imagine someone blowing up a balloon inside a cylinder, right? And then opening it out onto a flat, two-dimensional page. That's what you get if you look at the Mercator Projection. It's a cylindrical projection, it's conformal, and what this means is that the meridians and the parallels intersect at right angles, right? So we get this grid. And all the rhomb lines, which in navigation are what used to be called lines of constant direction, are shown as straight lines. This means that you plot a compass course between 2 points on a Mercator map, you can draw, the shortest distance will be a straight line between them. Now, you know that because the Earth is a globe, it's never a straight line, it's always curved. But the great achievement of the Mercator Projection was to be able to project out the three-dimensional Earth onto a two-dimensional plane such that it allowed for navigation to be plotted actually on the page, right? So the Mercator Projection at the very beginning is a navigational map. We show you what it actually looked like when it was introduced in this map of 1569 today at the University Library in Basel. It's a very large wall map, and you can see here where the drawings are, that it was printed in pieces and joined into this large sheet. And over here you have explanations of how the projection actually works and how you can plot a compass course on this map. It's worth remembering that the mathematics of this map was too sophisticated to actually be used for navigation when it was introduced in 1569. And it wasn't actually until after 1599 when Edward Wright published the logarithmic tables that would allow for plotting a course that the Mercator Projection came to be used extensively for shipping, for long-distance shipping in particular, right? Please have a seat. There's room in the front. Perhaps better known than this original 1569 Mercator map is this one of the most iconic maps that's reproduced all over the place. It's Abraham Ortelius' Situs Orbis Terrarum, or an image of the world, of the circle of lands of the world. The first popular map to use the Mercator Projection, published in 1570. Mercator and Ortelius were friends, likely worked closely on the question of how to represent the world. Mercator, the more accomplished cartographer, Ortelius, the more accomplished editor and marketer. And so this map becomes enormously popular, not just across Europe, but all across the world. We already know this map is made available to Akbar in the 1590s, brought by the Jesuits in a copy of Ortelius' Theatrum Orbis Terrarum. It is shipped to New Spain, today Mexico, around the same time. And so this image of the world very quickly has a kind of global spread and purchase already by the end of the 16th century. So the Mercator Projection is just the most obvious instance of what we might call the Cartographic Revolution of the 16th century. That is to say, a complete transformation in the way people imagined, measured, depicted, and used space. Cartography in this period touches on a variety of disciplines and brings them together: geography, astronomy, mathematics, scientific instrumentation, art, calligraphy, painting, philology, politics, theology, and cosmology. And if that seems like a long list, I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk, and we can rethink together how many of these disciplines we have traversed in the course of the next 45 minutes or so. Mapping, in that sense, is at the center of early modern culture. To think about the rise of cartography is to understand just what was so transformational about the Renaissance on a worldwide scale, and why so many scholars now argue that we should think of the Renaissance not merely as a regionally specific cultural movement in Europe, but as a worldwide shift in economic networks, political formations, and cultural self-understanding, marking, in other words, the beginning of early modernity on a global scale. And I can talk more about the sort of conflict between scholars about whether we should use the term Renaissance or the term early modern. You'll see that I go back and forth in this talk, and I can answer questions about that if you're curious. We might, in other words, by thinking about cartography as the center of early modern culture and as the backbone in some ways of an idea of the global Renaissance, as a way to usefully decenter European history by thinking in global terms, and to think about the ways in which representing the world also meant imagining oneself as not only the world enclosed. So in my time today, I will sketch out what this cartographic revolution was and why it was so emblematic of the Renaissance, imagined as both a global and a transcultural phenomenon. So let's take a look at some of the maps of the period. Maps are everywhere in the 16th century. This very famous painting by Hans Holbein the Younger, The Ambassadors, which may be familiar to some of you, is often described as an emblem of Renaissance humanism itself. You see all of these different instruments here, the lute, the book, which we know is Martin Luther's hymnal, so this was painted shortly after the Reformation. But what interests me here specifically are these two objects, which you can see here, in sort of detail, a terrestrial and a celestial globe, both of which take their place in this painting among the other emblems of human knowing, human possibility, and human progress in this period. Here we have two famous portraits of Elizabeth I, the Armada portrait, in which you can see, of course, she has her hand on a globe. And here the Ditchley portrait, where she's standing on a map of England over here, again, cementing political authority. And we're saying, I could give a whole lecture on paintings and images from the 16th and 17th century of people putting their hands on a globe or using a map in some ways as signs of political power or other kinds of dominance. This is the room of maps at the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, designed by Ignazio Danzi. You can see that over here its walls are lined with maps of different parts of Italy, and in the middle are these incredibly beautiful large Coronelli globes. Danzi did a version of this at greater scale at what is now the Vatican Galleries. This is the Gallery of Maps at the Vatican. Here you see frescoes painted of maps of Europe, as well as parts of Italy, and I'm giving you one detail here, the map of Sicily from the map gallery in the Vatican. This year, one of my favorite maps produced by her now was Dourado in Goa in 1571, one of the most beautiful remaining Portuguese manuscript atlases of the world, of which I've given you one folio. And here we are. Another way in which maps were used as allegorical or polemical prints. This is the so-called cordiform or heart-shaped map inside the Fool's Gap, where you can see that the face of the person has been replaced here by a world map. Here again, you see this famous miniature painting from the workshop of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Here is Jahangir embracing the Safavid Emperor Shah Abbas, both standing here on a globe, whose cartography seems to be derived, at least to a certain extent, from Ortelius's Theatrum Orbis, the map that you saw, the Cyprus Orbis. Here we see another series of portraits of Jahangir here standing on a globe here, standing on what is a globe, but the cartography has been replaced by allegorical Sufi imagery of the lion lying down with the lamb, known as Dadu Dam imagery here. So all this is to sort of suggest the extent to which maps are being used in all sorts of different ways, as architecture, as portraiture, as emblematic painting, and are being displayed in ways that signal a certain kind of power, right? So maps are not simply about getting from one place to the next in this period. They also telegraph a vision of oneself inside a kind of cultural world. This is a period that is marked by the printing revolution and by major changes in literacy and numeracy. Cartography brings these together to produce what some see as the beginning of the new science, and others as a culmination of mathematics and art. But at the same time, by providing a new vision of geography and history, maps also supported a new political vision by making possible imperial and colonial projects. And you remember the Armada portrait I showed you, where this picture of Elizabeth putting her hand on the globe is an attempt to telegraph her own power, even though you remember that the Spanish Armada was destroyed not by greater English force, but by bad weather for the most part, right? But once again, maps become deployed in the imagery here of political iconography in the period. But maps also fundamentally changed the way individuals understood their place in a cosmic system, because mapping the world, or a region, or a city, demanded that humans make themselves the measure of all things. And some of you may know the famous image of Vitruvian Man used so much in this period. But to make a map, and especially a world map, meant imagining a God's eye view of the globe. To imagine that you were somehow outside the plane of the world, looking at it, right? To kind of have a place above and beyond. But in so doing, you were also imaginatively displacing the position of God the Creator by saying that the human eye could in fact discern, represent, and understand the world from that position. And I'll just remind you that the 16th century is a time of enormous religious ferment all across the world, and to suggest that human ingenuity alone could occupy the position of God is to make a very powerful claim that the map then came to represent, right? But to get at some of these bigger issues, I'm going to focus here on two things. One is a very brief history of cartography to give you a sense of how the imagination of space in this period actually changed. And second, to look at two major events that precipitated the new cartography. Okay. So I'm going to take you on a rapid journey through cartographic history to give you a sense of how we got, just imaginatively, to where we are today. This map, which I'll come back to, is a beautiful mix of the medieval motif of the wind, figured here as human heads blowing air, as you can see, and this new vision of the map, not parts of the world not fully discovered. You can see the murkiness around the western part of North America slowly coming into view on a projection that still reminds us that mapping is struggling with the question of representing the three-dimensional Earth on a two-dimensional plane. All right, the word mappa in Latin can refer both to text and image. And the mappa mundi of antiquity and the Middle Ages were primarily symbolic maps, known as TO maps. And you can see why that is. Here's a T, here's an O. Okay? So most of these maps have this schematic framework. This image, which is taken from the very influential etymologies of Isidore of Seville, shows exactly why they were described as such, right? They show a tripartite world, Asia here, Europe, Africa, Mare Magnum Mediterraneum, the Mediterranean Sea, and Mare Oceanus, the ocean sea that surrounds them, okay? And this in Latin was referred to as orbis, circle, terrarum, land, right? Hence, T-O. And so you can see here a manuscript version of the same map that is given you schematically blown up here. Notice that the map is oriented to the east, so east is on top, hence Asia over here. And the imagined center of the map somewhere here is Jerusalem, and we'll see that in a second in more detail. This typically shows only the top, what we think of as the top half of the Earth, which is to say the other side, what we think of as the southern hemisphere, is not evident in these images. And so here you can see this a little bit more clearly here in schematic form and mapped here onto Google Earth. So you can see if you turn what we now understand to be the Earth, this is what it would look like schematically on a TO map. So this is a primary imagining of the spatiality of the world from the late 5th or 6th century all the way until we get to the 16th century, and we'll see that now in a moment. Perhaps one of the most famous of the medieval Mappae Mundi is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, a gigantic map which was on a church wall. And you can see here too the TO structure here, O, and the T here for the Mediterranean Sea. And these maps, as you can see with the orientation towards the east, had primarily a sacred function, to orient oneself in history and in time, particularly eschatological history. And here you can see Christ is on the top of the map. This is the blow-up here of this part. You can see the angels over here, and over here you can see the earth, right? There's a connection on this map between the world beyond, the next world, and this world, right? The point of this map is a spiritual orientation, not so much a terrestrial or geographic orientation as we might use Google Maps today. The translation of Ptolemy's geography into Latin in 1410 reintroduced the idea of charting land masses onto a grid, which I'll come back to in more detail in a moment. But I want to show you this early picture of the world in Hartmann Schädel's Liber Chronicarum from 1493, produced the same year as Columbus's voyage to discover the New World. The Schädel map is one of the first representations we have of a conical Ptolemaic projection being used to depict the world, as opposed to the TO maps that we just looked at, right? Notice how the Ptolemaic map is very different from the TO map. Most importantly, north is up, south is down, right? It's a fundamental kind of turning around of just what and how you are depicting the land itself. But we still only have in 1493 three continents: Africa, Asia. This is not Australia, but possibly may have to do with some of the islands in the southeast. It's unclear exactly what it is. And Europe, of course, right over here. If we fast forward about 80 years, we see a very different world picture. Right, so in a span of 80 years, from 1493 to 1570, we see a complete transformation in the way in which people imagine what global space actually looks like. You can see here the image of the map is transformed in really crucial ways. Most obviously, discovery of the Americas. There's a kind of expansion of the Ptolemaic world to include so-called New World. There's a new way of representing space mathematically. The extensive use of the Ptolemaic grid, which becomes in fact part of the art of the map itself. There's also a new sense of what's important to depict on a map. Notice that there is no Jesus and there are no angels. And there's a new focus here on political boundaries and particularly of important land features. Notice the Nile over here. Notice the Amazon, right? So this is a map that combines in important ways political as well as physical features to highlight a very terrestrial view of what mapping is actually about. It's about being in this world, in this space, and thinking about where you might move horizontally across the world as opposed to vertically towards God. But it's also worth noting that this map is grounded in humanistic learning in all sorts of uncanny ways. You see these medallions over here. They have stoic admonitions from Seneca and Cicero that warn us against looking possessively at ownership of the world on this map, but to remember that human beings, for instance, are no more than a pinpoint, a microscopic piece of this larger whole. It's worth noting also that the production of this map involves the invention of new calligraphic techniques to be able to actually write all these place names into the map. Mercator was famous before the projection as the writer of the first treatise on calligraphy for map makers, published in the 1540s, and in fact was trained as a goldsmith's apprentice, and his ability to engrave finely on globes was what gave him his start as a map, eventually moved on to being a map maker. This is a map in which mathematics and art are spectacularly on display, right? But at the same time, it also asks us, it challenges us to think about orders of reality. You see this giant continent here that looks like Antarctica? It's not Antarctica. It says here, Terra Australis Nondum Cognita, which is to say the austral land that has not yet been discovered, right? So at this point, it is a completely imaginary depiction of what might be a southern continent that no one actually knew was here, right? So notice how this is a map that also is able to encode within it radically different orders of what we might call facticity, right? On the one hand, we know that Africa is here. People actually did go all the way around it. We have specific names of places here. But then we have this gigantic continent here that is uncanny to us today because we know there's Antarctica there. But it's important that at the time, people thought for all sorts of reasons that there should be a continent there, but there was no evidence of there being a continent there, right? So much of the evidence came from a belief that the physics of the Earth required there to be more land to balance out continents in the north with continents in the south. So it had nothing to actually do with any kind of exploration, so much as with hypotheses about the geophysics of how land and water should operate together to be held together in some kind of equilibrium on the Earth. Okay, so how do we get from here to here, right? What was the defining event that actually allowed us to shift so radically from one kind of view to another? So the first of these I'm going to talk about today is the rediscovery of Ptolemy's geography. This is a detail from Raphael's very famous painting, The School of Athens, which you may have seen before. And facing us here is the historian Strabo, who holds a celestial globe. You see the stars on it. And behind us, who's got his back to us here, is the young Ptolemy, who holds in his hand a terrestrial globe. Strabo is famous for having written a 17-volume geography, considered one of the most important works on that subject in classical antiquity. It's a descriptive geography, which means it includes and describes in great detail regions of the known world. And it was usually paired with Ptolemy's geography, which provided a method for mathematically constructing a map of the world with an extensive catalog of places and their relative distance between different points on the map. But who was Ptolemy? Ptolemy was a mathematician, astronomer, geographer, and author of, wow, that stayed on, but we lost power. Okay. Do we need to get the light back? No? Yeah? It'll come back? Okay. Who lived in the 2nd century, and whose geography is a discussion of the knowledge of the subject in the Greco-Roman world in late antiquity. And most importantly, it includes directions on how to map the known world using a grid, and it gives lists of coordinates of major places in terms of latitude and longitude. Let's talk briefly here about the grid and why the grid is such an incredible rediscovery in Renaissance Europe. We know, of course, taking it that many of you are scientists, that the grid is sort of one of the obvious things we take for granted as the basis of modern science. And yet it was not until the rediscovery of the geography in the 14th century that the technology of using the grid to map space became available once more in the Western world. Ptolemy may well have been the first to use the grid to measure and represent space. And the geography is the only ancient text we have that gives the coordinates of latitude and longitude for various places, some of which are erroneous, but many of the others remain remarkably accurate. So understanding how the grid works, I mean, this should be pretty self-explanatory here. Any mathematical point on the Earth's surface can be represented by coordinates of latitude and longitude. It offers a clear scale that makes distances measurable in relation to each other, and it's also powerfully decentralizing, since no one place is privileged by the system. Every place is represented in exactly the same way by this method of latitude and longitude. It's often been called the kind of first instance of the scientific revolution and of empiricism, because it's based on actual mathematics and survey techniques. And in fact, with the reintroduction of the Ptolemaic grid, land survey techniques in Europe underwent enormous change in the 16th century as well, and had very important repercussions for things like, for instance, taxation, because now you could actually know how big someone's property was. Ptolemy also discusses the basic problem of mapping, which is how to represent a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional plane. And I like to think about this when I teach this as the orange problem, right? If we have to open out the orange peel and represent that on a two-dimensional plane, we're going to run into all sorts of problems. And so these are just three ways in which you could cut up the orange peel and place it out on an actual plane. And you can see how radically different the sorts of representations one might get if one is actually going to do this. There are, of course, lots of different kinds of map projections that we could talk about. These are some of the best known ones. You can see the conical projection up here is what Ptolemy preferred. There are two conical projections offered by Ptolemy in the geography. The azimuthal polar projections become very common in the 17th and 18th century, and many others have been used since. And here are a few more modern projections. We started the lecture looking at Mercator and Gall-Peters here, and here are several others. I'm going to leave you with my favorite projection, the 1996 Waterman projection here, the butterfly, which is an octahedral projection, and is also an equal area projection. But come back to Ptolemy. This is a picture of the Ptolemaic world in a Ptolemaic projection produced by Mercator in his edition of Ptolemy's Geography published in 1578. This is after he had invented the Mercator projection. The geography was lost for almost 1,000 years until a Greek manuscript was rediscovered in 1295, and the first copy was brought to Europe in 1397 and translated into Latin in 1410. Right, so it's the early 15th century by the time Ptolemy is being read in Latin in Europe. After which its influence is felt almost immediately and very powerfully. It's first published in print from one of the earliest books to be printed in 1477, and it goes on to become one of the bestsellers of the 16th century. The story of the recovery, translation, and influence of Ptolemy's geography makes it a classic instance of Renaissance humanism, right, with its fascination for classical antiquity and its desire to uncover, learn from, and go beyond the accomplishments of the ancients. The geography that enabled early modern cartography, but it is soon left behind and superseded by new innovations and discoveries. And I can tell you one of the great pleasures of working in an archive has been to sort of simply look through. I spent an entire summer looking through pretty much every major edition of Ptolemy's Geography published between 1500 and 1600. And one of the amazing things that you see is you get the original Ptolemaic maps that are produced, and then as we get more and more information about the world, we have new maps being leafed in as people realize that the Ptolemaic representations aren't exactly matching up to what they now see with new information of the New World and other places, and we get the production of new maps inspired by the Ptolemaic corpus, but still placed in relationship to it. It's not until the very end of the 16th century that Ptolemy is genuinely pushed aside. So Mercator's 1578 Ptolemy is the last edition of Ptolemy published in this sort of old style. We have a few stray editions into the 18th century, but the great boom ends with Mercator's publication here in 1578. So apart from Ptolemy's geography, the other main reason for the Cartographic Revolution was, of course, the discovery of the Americas. It can be argued that Columbus's discovery of the New World was itself the consequence of the rediscovery of Ptolemy's geography, and certainly Ptolemy's estimates of the Earth's circumference, which were far too small, influenced Columbus's project. He didn't think that China was that far, and that has a lot to do with the measurements of in the geography. I've given you here an image of Martin Behan's globe, which was produced in 1492, which was likely used by Columbus for planning his voyage out east. But the discovery of the Americas, and more generally the many European voyages that often make this period be called the Age of Exploration, in turn transform maps and cartographic technologies back in Europe. And so a quick reminder of the main voyages here. Here we see the voyages of Columbus, here in red, Vespucci over here, and of Cabral and Cabot. Here we have Vasco da Gama's sea voyage to India and turning around the coast of Africa. And these discoveries of new lands and new sea routes were rapidly transferred to maps, but raised a lot of troubling questions. And here we have what is considered the first eyewitness map of the New World, produced by Juan de la Cosa, the earliest map of the Americas. And you can see here, I should sort of start by saying that this is a Portland style map, which I have not talked about, and I can talk about more in questions, but I'll get to briefly. Over here you see Africa, over here is Europe, over here is Asia, and what we have here, of course, is an addition somewhere here of the land masses that were discovered or imagined to be discovered at this point of the New World. Right, so there's a kind of squeezing in of the New World into primarily the old Ptolemaic tripartite world. You can see this more clearly here in the Continental Planisphere, which shows the Treaty of Tordesillas that is signed between Spain and Portugal, dividing up the world. Of course, the Treaty of Tordesillas itself is based in some ways on a misleading image, which is to say that in drawing this line to the west of which everything would be that is owned by Spain, and to the east of which everything would be owned by Portugal, what both powers did not realize is there was an other side over here in the Pacific, where east and west joined, right? And hence we would have the continuous wars over the ownership of the Spice Islands, right? Hence we have the Spanish battle for the Philippines and its expansion outward, as well as the Portuguese struggle to retain control of the Moluccas. What we have here is the first world map to try to incorporate the Americas into the Ptolemaic conical world scheme. This is the 1507 Martin Waldseemüller world map, and here you see the old Ptolemaic world and the squeezing in, or the breaking of the frame, to add here South America and the piece of North America that was known by 1507. Right. What's interesting here too is here is a mirror image of this map. Right. If you were to turn it around, what the other side of the globe would look like. Right over here as an inset. And we have here the great map makers looking down at the making of the map. Right. Actually, we have Vespucci on this side and Ptolemy on this side, the heroes of this map, looking at the map. Right. So in a sense, this map too is not just about the feat of incorporating the New World into the map frame, but it also tells a story about the history of what it took to produce these maps, right, within the same plane of the map itself. Another version of this, inspired by the Waldseemüller map, probably Johannes Reusch's world map, which was printed in an edition of Ptolemy's Geography, published in Rome in 1507. Oops, sorry. And so here again, you can see another attempt, a different one, to incorporate. This is the new world right over here, being squashed in between Africa on this side and Asia on the other, right? Different ways to kind of think about how to solve this problem. Now, the other important kind of maps we have not talked about, and can answer in questions, is the Portland style map, which are also navigational maps that we use that may or may not have been used in actual navigation. Here is a luxury Portland produced by Joba Omen. The so-called Queen Mary Atlas, which is also one of the earliest maps to show the New World, here produced, we think, in 1568, likely produced earlier and then gifted to Queen Mary. Here, again, from Diogomen's Universal Atlas, another Portland-style map here centered on India, another map from Vazuradu's Goa Atlas, 1571, showing the New World. So you can see already how we've moved in a span of 50 years from these very sketchy, uncertain incorporations of the Americas into a map of the world to these, if you look at this incredible Dorado map, right, look at the number of place names here in the Gulf of Mexico, right, the incredible care with which and the amount of new knowledge that is being able to be represented on these map planes. Okay. So by the time we get to 1581, the union of the crowns of Spain and Portugal, which formed the first truly global empire in 1581, and here you just see how the world is divided up between Spain and Portugal. You can see how the fact of there's a synergy between the creation of global empire and the production of global mapping, right? One feeds the other and then feeds back into the other in a way in which the support for the production of these maps, and of which these are particularly good examples because the Portuguese and Spanish crowns thought of maps as state secrets and controlled very tightly the knowledge of actual places and their representation on maps, that there's a very close nexus between the process of mapping and the sharing of cartographic knowledge and the development of empire across the world. Spain, Portugal, the first world empire, demonstrates very clearly that whoever controls the map controls the world. And maps become central then to the claiming of ownership and to geopolitical positioning, right? Maps are considered top state secrets. We know, for instance, that Francis Drake, to facilitate his circumnavigation in 1571, steals a set of the Vaz Dorado maps because they're the only accurate representation of the Straits of Magellan, so he knows how to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this is a gigantic scandal because the Portuguese definitely do not want him to complete his circumnavigation. By the time in 1570, when Mercator's friend Tordesillas publishes his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, a book that is often described as the first published atlas of the world, maps are a well-established aspect of Renaissance life. And the mathematical innovations and incorporations of the new continents into the world map is astonishingly close to what we know today through a tool like Google Earth. But let me say a word here about this frontispiece as a kind of culmination of the story about mapping in my talk today. I began with how cartography is a profoundly interdisciplinary project. I said it includes geography, astronomy, mathematics, scientific instrumentation, art, calligraphy, painting, philology, politics, theology, and cosmology. And I think it should be clear by now that we've actually covered most of these, perhaps with the exception of philology. I want to say a word here about how this frontispiece captures allegorically a vision of the world that these maps then support, and that represents in an extracted way the kind of intellectual and conceptual work that mapmaking demands, but also that it invites from the viewer looking at it, right? So represented here in this Roman style archway are images here of the four continents, right? This is Europe, ruling on top. This is Asia, with her wealth and finery. Here is Africa, and here is the Americas, right? Much has been written and said about the incredible vision of imperialism already at work in this 1570 frontispiece to a world atlas. But on the other hand, we can also see here the symbols of scientific power crowning and supporting the political ground, which allows Europe to be on top, right? We have 1, 2, 3 images of the world. Here again, the celestial globe, the terrestrial globe. Oops. Come back. No. Okay, here we are. Let's see if I can take us back. Hold on. We have a preview while I get us back to where we were, or a review, not accurately. Okay, here we are. Okay. You can see here again that this image of the globe with a cross, known as a globus cruciger, one of the traditional symbols of political power used by European monarchs, echoes and amplifies the iconography, of course, of the scientific globe on either side of Europe here, right? By contrast, we have very archaic technology depicted here with the figure of the naked America who holds two heads, one being burned here as a sign of cannibalism in the New World. And we have here a bow and arrows, right? So there's a narrative here of technological progress as we move from the bottom here with America all the way to the top with Europe crowned by these technological emblems of science. Should be evident too from this, the kind of lettering we see here. You might recall for you the ancient stone etching that we see of inscriptions from ancient Greece or ancient Rome. And that's not incidental either. The idea here that there's a kind of canonicity and a monumentality to the intellectual and scientific work that would be within the pages of this atlas knowingly echoes these classical motifs to suggest that this is building on classical antiquity, but going far beyond what the ancients ever knew, because of course the ancients did not know of the existence of the New World. I want to end with this map, one of my favorite maps, an expansion of the Mercator World Map of 1595, redrawn and embellished, first in 1630 and then reproduced again in 1663. Which also amplifies once again the kind of incredible interdisciplinarity that I've been talking about. Here we see again not just the double hemispheric world map, we see images of important explorers and map makers in the four corners. We see visions of the four elements, water, earth, air, and fire, right? We see the sun and the moon to remind us of the Earth's place in space. We see these emblems of power. Once again, so this is a celestial globe framed here by emblems of royalty and power, right? And this is a map that is not simply about what the world might look like cartographically, right? It's a map that's a cultural icon for what it means to be able to depict what the world looks like in Europe in the 17th century. So once again, the politics of this map emerge in the way in which the map is framed, both with this kind of ancient medieval scientific foundation based on the four elements, but from which we get the kind of mathematical map coming forward, right? It should be evident from these images why I suggested that the Renaissance itself ought to be reimagined in a truly global scope. That the history of world mapping in this period, even within Europe, highlights the impact and pressures of a newly globalizing world and presents interesting analogs to our own dilemmas. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Yes? Yes?
We'll get the mic across to you.
Yeah, the OG maps that you talked about totally does not include the Americas.
Yes.
So is it because that the Americas were not discovered by then? I mean, the New World per se?
Yes, absolutely. So we can see CO maps in medieval manuscripts from the late 6th century onwards. From the 6th century until the late 15th century, when the New World was in fact discovered, and I always hate to use the word discovered because they were always there, discovered by Europeans. In European maps from this period, we see the tripartite or the tricontinental structure, because they were simply not known.
And the Mediterranean Sea, as you mentioned, occupies a key spot.
Yes.
In the map. Is it because that most of it started from Europe? I mean, the explorations per se.
So these, I mean, two things. One is that these CO maps that I'm talking about, I mean, I'm talking primarily about a kind of European tradition that is then exported outward after the 16th century. There do exist indigenous mapping traditions in different parts of the world, but none of them use the particular grid technology that becomes defining of modern mapping, both in Europe and beyond. So yes, on the one hand, they are located in the Mediterranean because they have come from that part of the world. But more importantly, more than being from that part of the world, the most important function of CO maps is spiritual, right? And so they are used for thinking, either going on pilgrimage or thinking about going on pilgrimage. And so the Holy Land is Palestine, right? And so the most important place that you can represent as being at the center is Jerusalem. And so the role of these maps is not to think about a kind of our position in space, it's to think about our position vis-a-vis God. And if the holy city is in Palestine where God died, then my map needs to point me to how to go there. So the Mediterranean becomes hugely important for that reason. The Mediterranean is also the space from late antiquity onward, which is from the 7th, 8th century onward, is constantly the site of conflict between Christians and Muslims, right? And again, a fight here for spiritual passage to get to Palestine. So all of those reasons. Yes?
Hi. Thank you so much. It was fantastic, and I wish we didn't have to end. I have two questions. One is regarding the map we have in front of us. So there's an image in the center at the bottom.
Yes.
And is that sort of an image of colonization?
Yes, it is. It's Europe.
It's Europe, right?
Yeah.
And in one of the earlier maps,
Yeah.
Africa is presented in a different color from the rest of the map.
Yeah.
What's the reason for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and actually it's a little bit misleading on this map. So one of the things to know about the production of these maps is these are printed maps, and in fact I didn't have time to talk about this in some detail, but the shift from manuscript map production, where somebody actually sat and hand drew the map, to printed map production, where you could run off multiple copies of the same map, was itself an incredible technological shift that takes place really in about the 1540s, when woodblock printing is replaced by copperplate engraving as the basis for printed map production. But what that meant is a map like this would be printed, white and black, and then would be hand-colored. So all the colors that you see here were then painted after the fact. So the same map exists in multiple states, many of which are not colored. This is a particularly beautiful example but it's not fully colored. So you can see what's happened here is this is an incomplete map where only Africa has been colored, and the colorist has not yet gotten around to coloring the other continents. So there are other states of this map in which all the continents are colored, the regions are colored differently. So also a fun fact, it's mostly women who did the coloring. Yeah. Yes.
Regarding...
Yes. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. The question is, we know that we can determine latitude right from the series or even earlier than that. But the determination of longitude only comes about in the 15th century.
18th century.
Sorry?
The determination of longitude at sea, not till the late 18th century.
Yeah, but I'm saying, at what point did we start determining longitude so that the maps could actually be correctly according to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a sort of a two-part answer. So determining longitude on land is obviously considerably less complicated than determining longitude at sea. So longitude at land has been attributed to Galileo and his followers, so in the kind of by the early 17th century. But longitude at sea is not definitively established until the late 18th century. I mean, there's famously the voyages across the world to establish the transit of Venus in 1773 was also the time at which people were able to synchronize and thus establish methods for determining longitude at sea. So one of the challenges of the Mercator projection, even though I said it's navigational projection, it's to be used, it wasn't actually used extensively until the mid to late 17th century, when the method of determining longitude on land is established, that then allows the plotting of maps before you actually leave, but that still doesn't solve the question of how do you know where you are on a map when you're in the open sea. And that is, and so people have argued, for instance, that the truly great age of empire, which is the 19th century, is really post all of these technological developments, that we're still in this kind of in-between, not quite there world in the sort of late 16th to the 18th century. And mapping technology itself shifts dramatically. What maps look like from the late 17th, from really the 18th century onward, completely different. And a lot of that is influenced by better instrumentation and better ways of determining where one actually is, particularly in the open sea. Yes.
So I have a couple of questions, but regarding the EO map, does it somehow relate to the consideration in time that the world was flat and surrounding was the ocean?
And the other question?
And the other question was, so these are mostly from the perspective of Europe, and that's why it's sort of in the center. So have you looked at maps, say, from, say, Orient to places like China, Japan? How would they look like?
So both great questions. So first, I love to say, the flat Earth theory is just historically not borne out. There were not many people that we actually know who thought the Earth was flat in any kind of meaningful way. So we already know that we have accounts of the building of globes in late antiquity, and we know by the time of Ptolemy's geography in the 2nd century that not only did people clearly understand that the Earth was a globe and that mapping entailed, a two-dimensional depiction of a three-dimensional object, which fundamentally means that you could not have thought the Earth was flat, right? So in some ways, the flat Earth mythology is exactly that. I mean, people do talk about the flatness of the Earth in terms of one's immediate phenomenal experience, right? If I'm walking down a road, I don't actually think that the Earth is round. I sort of see it as being flat. So we do see that. But did, in a meaningful way, early scientists, mathematicians actually believe that? Not really, as far as we know. It is worth saying, however, that there was a lot of debate about the other side of the Earth, right? And so we have all these amazing stories about, whether or not the so-called Antipodes, which is the land underneath one's feet in Greek, could actually have people, or was the climate just, inhospitable to people actually living there? And this, these stories of people, whose heads grew on their chests, and the Hartmann Shadle map that I showed you is famous, if I can find it, just because it's cool. And I didn't talk about this. Here we are. So if you look at these little people over here, these monstrous people were what they imagined lived on the other side of the earth, right? And so we have all of these sort of fictional and other stories of just like these crazy creatures who populated the other side of the earth because clearly you couldn't live there, right? So that is very much a very real fiction that is perpetrated actually quite late, and it's not really until the late 15th century that people kind of recognize that that's not really the case anymore. But there are a lot of writings in the 16th century too, where people, I mean, just like the canonical Amerigo Vespucci's Mundus Novus, the first text to describe what the New World looked like. I mean, it's full of this kind of incredible sense of wow, like those strange people are not here, but wait, there are naked women, and so we do have that mythology very much. The question about non-European maps, it's a very tricky question for a bunch of different reasons, because scholars disagree about what exactly what you can call a map, right? And I'll give you an example of that. I put in here precisely because I often get the question that you ask. These images, these allegorical portraits of Jahangir, right? Is this a map or is this not a map, right? Depending on who you ask, there are some scholars who will say, no, in fact, this is a map, because it's a map that is allegorically depicting the place of the emperor in the cosmos, and we have here well-known Hindu cosmological imagery, the fish, the goat, a modern globe on top, and this is a kind of weird hybrid. Here we have Hindu and Islamic imagery coming together cosmologically to show us the emperor's place on the world. So there is a case to be made that these are maps, in the same sense that the medieval Mappa Mundi are maps. They're spiritual maps that orient us in religious space and time. There are other scholars who will tell you, and especially historians of science, that these are definitely not maps. You can call them allegorical prints, you can call them cosmological drawings, but you cannot call them maps. So that definitional question makes it very difficult then for us to think about, what is the counterpart of these European maps. So I'm talking about European maps largely because there is a fair amount of agreement about the movement from a kind of earlier moment of representations of global space in a spiritual vein towards the mathematical representation of space in the 16th century. What's also interesting about this is that it is disseminated outward with incredible speed, right? There's a whole side story I could talk about the famous Speedy Race map of 1517 produced under the Emperor Suleiman in the Ottoman world, which looks like it may have very early knowledge of the New World. But even the Ottomans adopted European mapping technologies very quickly, and there's much to be said here about the twin Arabic Greek tradition around Ptolemy. So there's a very robust tradition of medieval Islamic cartography as well that leads to its own tradition. In South Asia and in China, the story is very different. There's a famous story of the Jesuit Matteo Ricci, who takes a European Ortelius map to Macau and shows it has taken and shown it to the emperor, and the emperor's like, well, this is clearly not the representation of my kingdom. And what we have within 15 years is the production of a map centered on China according to these Ptolemaic principles, right? So the kind of diffusion is so powerful outward that, it's definitionally easier to talk about the kind of movement of this kind of mathematical, geometrically oriented mapping, but there's plenty of important and interesting work about other forms of mapping, and I said mapping in quotation marks because, as I said, you could call these maps in a meaningful way. And I would just refer you, if you don't know it, and those of you who are interested, there's a fabulous project called the History of Cartography project out of the University of Chicago. Much of their volumes are available open source now. I think the first 3 volumes are available open source online. It's the definitive encyclopedia on the history of cartography. And one of the things that they struggle with is precisely this. Can we talk about indigenous mapping, for instance, in the Americas? How do we talk about sort of, the incredible knowledge of geography that clearly Polynesian navigators had? Right, so questions like that obviously have a very important bearing on a kind of non-European story about mapping. I mean, in my own work, I think a lot about this, or have recently been thinking a lot about this in the context of South Asia, partly because though we know European maps were introduced into South Asia by the late 16th century, we also knew that the Delhi Sultanate emperors, as well as the Mughal emperors, and certainly the Vijayanagara Empire, was very interested in global cartography long before the introduction of European maps. We know that Vijayanagara Empire, for instance, traded with the Portuguese for much of the 16th century, and the Portuguese were, they were producing some of the best maps in the world. So there is, I think, an important story that we are yet to tell about the knowledge of cartographic knowledge in South Asia in this period as well. And it's very challenging because there are not very many extant records, and partly because of issues around climate and other things. It's a long, not totally satisfactory answer, but
Sure. Okay, we'll take 4 more questions.
Yeah.
Amrita, Raj, gentleman in the back.
So I'm just curious because early explorers all went around the world, they circumnavigated around. But I think some of the British expeditions went they wanted to go around the pole. Frobisher, I think, I'm not quite sure.
Much later, yeah. So there are 2 big circumnavigations. There's the Magellan circumnavigation from 1518 to 1522, and Magellan himself dies and doesn't actually make it back all the way, but the expedition does. And then there's the Drake expedition in 1571. So there, apart from those 2, there are no other major circumnavigations in the 16th century. There are polar expeditions. For instance, already in the late 15th century, we have British attempts to find an Arctic passage through the Arctic to the New World as being kind of shorter and also bypassing Spanish control of. And then we do have, there's a lot of interest in the existence of a possible southern continent, but not many people actually make it to the Straits of Magellan because the location of the Straits of Magellan is a tightly controlled secret. So as I said, even Drake had to steal maps to know how to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So that's the kind of, the polar expeditions we're talking about are much later. They're 18th and 19th century expeditions. I mean, we know, I'm trying to remember this detail now. I think that first actual sighting of the Antarctic continent is not till the late 17th century, and it's not really until the Cook expedition in the 18th century that we actually have evidence of the existence of another continent in the south. So it's amazingly quite recent. Yeah.
Don't the geo maps seem a little bit simplistic for the map making at the time? Because if I remember correctly, there's this thing called the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that of the Mediterranean, which was in like great detail, like every port, even rocks in the sea and stuff.
Yeah.
And TO seems like a very watered down version of that, like you're just representing it as a straight line. So considering you were actually mapping those areas, wouldn't they have a more detailed view of what the local...
So it's a great question, but it's really 2 questions in one. And so to answer it, I'm going to take you to this. To this map. So the work of the Periplus, which is descriptive geography, where you actually write out in text what you see and where you go and how you get from one place to the other, and you name places and you name physical features, is a very different kind of enterprise than cartography, which requires actually literally moving your point of view not within the plane of the Earth, but above the plane of the Earth. So what you're doing in descriptive geography is you're saying, I am physically traveling from here to there, and I'm going to describe to you what I saw along the way. So you're within the horizontal plane, right? For a cartographic representation, you're actually trying to remove yourself to a vertical plane from which you are looking at something below. So one of the ways to think about this is a little bit like zooming out in Google Maps, right? When you zoom out far enough, you lose the clarity of the local details a lot, because what you're trying to get at is like a large picture view, right? So the relationship between descriptive geography, particularly kind of detailed periplus-like geography, and the TO map is a question of scale and a question of zooming out, right? But the second thing that's important there is the TO map's purpose is not to name places. The TO map's purpose is to help us to meditate on Jerusalem, the center of the religious world at the time. Right? Its orientation is spiritual and theological and cosmological in the larger metaphysical sense than it is in the geographical sense of being in the plane of space. But the second part of this is that this map, as I mentioned in passing, is based on what was known as Portland charts. And I didn't talk about this form of mapping at all, for the most part, in my lecture. Portland mapping is a very particular form of mapping that exists in Europe. We have, I think, the oldest example from the 10th century. And if you cut out this part, which is the New World, and you look at just this, what you'll see here is we actually don't have because we have names, place names here, we can't see it so clearly, of ports all the way around the coast of each of the major continents, right? And so these Portland charts, which were, and you also will see here room lines, where you might put your compass and plot a course from one place to another. There's a lot of argument with historians about whether Portland charts were actually used for navigation in the Mediterranean or whether they were simply decorative objects. Having recently worked with one of the kind of, I guess, few experts in the world on Portland, I've come to be convinced myself that he's right, and in fact they probably were used. What we have remaining are luxury versions of Portland, but there were probably non-luxury versions that were used that we don't have anymore. But one of the interesting things about Portland is that these are in fact maps that are made not in this kind of elevated plane, but they are made to try to be within the plane of navigation, and hence their distinctive feature is that there's often nothing inside the continents, which is why you can't really see them very clearly. But what you can see are these incredible detailed place names that are written in with hair paintbrushes for the most part. They're kind of incredible, these maps. The history of the Portland chart and the emergence of the Ptolemaic grid maps is a really interesting one, because one does not immediately replace the other. In fact, they coexist for much of the 16th century. And let's see, here we go. Okay, so this map here that you see, the 1571 Val-Durable map, is interesting because it combines the style of the Portland chart with the technology of the Ptolemaic grid. Right, so these Portuguese manuscript atlases that were produced roughly between 1545 and 1580 are really striking, because this is a manuscript map, which means it's not printed, it was drawn by hand, and it combines Portland iconography and style. You see the kind of incredible careful place naming, the room lines here, the compass rose, which are all sort of hallmarks of the Portland map. But it does it, the representation clearly uses an underlying grid underneath that map, right? So that coming together of these two technologies that happened over the course of the 16th century eventually leads to the kind of replacement of the Portland by the kind of Ptolemaic grid world map. So that is happening at the same time. So the kind of conceptual work of something like the Pericles fits better with the Portland style map than the scalar removal of the TO map. This is a long answer.
You talked about how the Cartographic Revolution essentially brought a shift from, say, a spiritual mode of map making to a more mathematical, geometrical oriented kind of map making. But the last map that you showed us, I feel like that draws on religious and spiritual allegory very heavily. So could you talk a little bit about the kind of influences, the religious and theological and spiritual influences that continued in this so-called quote-unquote modern map, and even if they were subtle or covert?
Yeah, extremely well observed, and yes, that was kind of my Trojan horse here, because I love to talk about this. I mean, so the standard story in the history of science, about, especially in the history of cartography, is the replacement of a kind of older, spiritual, religious, allegorical map, the TO map and the Mappa Mundi, with these new scientific, geometric, mathematical, empirically accurate maps, right? But it is also the case, if you actually look at these maps and spend time with them, that what we actually see is the coexistence, or the kind of recrafting of religious and cosmological frameworks to be adapted to meet the new technological reality, right? So you're absolutely right that what we have here is some kind of Mary-like figure, who maybe Mary, maybe an angel who's offering blessings. I mean, you have here similarly some kind of classical fire god, who is, the god of fire here. The crowning of Europe, who's getting homage paid to her by peoples of the world, right? That itself recalls the kind of crown, the sort of Christ at the Last Judgment. So there are lots of echoes here of sort of religious iconography that persists. But even more importantly, and this is particularly the case of Mercator, and it's sort of a fascinating side story where we think of the Mercator Projection, colonialism, European empire, but Mercator himself belonged to the small dissident sect of Protestants who believed really in world peace and unity. And so he saw his projection as actually the cartographic equivalent of bringing the nations of the world together under one banner. He was buddies with a guy whose great goal in life was to be able to print the Quran in Latin. right? So this is a small, weird group of people, among whom was Tordesillas and Mercator, whose project here is not actually imperial. His project has very much to do with the kind of advance of a certain vision of world Christian peace that is tolerant of other religions as well. I mean, it's a very strange moment in the 1570s and 1580s. So that religious vision very much exists. I mean, one of the things that I've worked on extensively is why the Mercator Atlas of 1595, kind of real icon of modern sort of science, begins with Mercator's super weird account of the creation of the world, like rewrites Genesis. But it's this little biblical prelude to this Atlas book that is based on state-of-the-art maps. So the question is, why put this sort of biblical frame onto a map that's supposedly free of religion, right? So the short answer is that religion and religious iconography and concerns persist well through the 17th century. And it's not really perhaps until the 18th century that we really see the removal of these kind of very Baroque frames for maps, and we see the more the plain line art of just a map as map without the extra embellishments, really in the mid-18th century. And it's just visually really striking when that happens. And it's also worth pointing out that, you know, the word atlas used for maps is also the word used for scientific diagrams beginning in the Enlightenment forward. So there's a very important and interesting visual similarity between the cleaning up of maps, the falling away of this religious framing in its visual work, and the development of scientific drawing in the 17th century. And these two things are, if you look at natural histories, for instance, in the 18th century, as well as maps in the 18th century, they share visual conventions of various kinds that are really striking. So, yeah.
Just in the interest of time, is it a quick one?
Yes.
Okay.
You said that these maps had a religious context. Would you say that the maps right after this, because you stopped at a particular era, then chose to take on a political narrative?
I don't want to separate those two things out. I mean, I would say that these are very political maps. I mean, here's Europe being paid homage to by the Palazzo Vecchio, right? I mean, it's right there. So I think what I would say is that the religious framing becomes less prominent, right? I mean, one of the things that persists throughout the 16th, 17th century is a kind of vision of universal Christian empire, right? I mean, that falls away already in the 16th century as different European empires are fighting with each other. It's quite clear there's not going to be some kind of united Christian empire. So that vision falls away, but the idea of it and the authority of it, we remember, of course, that the Spanish conquest of the New World and other parts of the world was in the name of Pope, right? I mean, they were kind of bringing more souls to Christ. It was the justification. So those justifications fall away to more straightforwardly commercial justifications by the early 18th century. So what we're seeing here, this is an interesting transitional map. It's first produced in 1630, it's reissued in 1663 in the very important monumental Blau Atlas, this kind of beautiful folio, 10-folio volumes. But after the Blau Atlas, we just don't see large atlases like that being produced anymore. What we do see are these much more commercially or politically oriented map sheets that are collected into and bound into map books for individual owners, right? So in that sense, the religious motivational legitimation becomes less important, but the commercial and therefore political view becomes much more so. We see a lot more property maps starting in the 18th century onward. The great national mapping projects also begin in the 18th century. The British mapping of India, the Great Land Survey of 1851, for instance, is perhaps the largest culmination of that process of national and imperial mapping that begins really in France in the mid-18th century. So yeah.
We could go on.
Yes.
But perhaps we can take this over to tea. And,
I'm happy to answer more questions over tea, I promise.
but let's thank Aisha again. It was fantastic.